This is Indian Country Today.
Esquili, thank you for joining us. I'm Patty Thalahungva. Across the U.S., there are nearly 2,000 think tanks, each one addressing various needs in their local or regional area. But how many of them are established by Native Americans? How many of them approach their research from a Native perspective? Earlier this year, the University of Montana announced the formation of the American Indian Governance and Policy Institute. It's housed in the university's Department of Native American Studies. Joining us today to tell us about the purpose of this think tank is Heather Cahoon. She's the executive director and created the organization. Cahoon is also an assistant professor in the Native American Studies Department, and she's a citizen of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes. Welcome, Heather.
Thank you.
Also joining us is Gail Small. She's a sociologist and attorney. In 1995, she was named Woman of the Year by Ms. Magazine. Small is a citizen of the Northern Cheyenne tribe and grew up in Lame Deer, Montana. Gail is the director of the grassroots nonprofit Native Action. The group is dedicated to protecting the Northern Cheyenne's sovereignty, culture, religion, and environment. Welcome, Gail.
Thank you.
And finally, we have the chairman of the Little Shell Tribe of Chippewa Indians, Gerald Gray. Chairman Gray is in his second term, and he helped lead the effort to restore his tribe's federal recognition. He has 20-plus years of experience in market research and media and owns the firm G&G. Welcome, Chairman Gray.
Thank you for having me.
Well, let's start with you, Heather. How long had you thought about forming this Native think tank?
Probably 5 or 6, maybe 7 years. I was teaching as an adjunct at the university, and my background is in federal Indian policy and tribal sovereignty. And so, just working in that field and doing research in that field was really the beginning of, when I saw a need for an entity like this. And then it was a few years after that when I got to do outreach and work with tribal governments that I realized, how it should come together. Met all the right people on the advisory council, among them Gerald and Gail, and began putting it together probably about 2 years ago.
And then in that process, did you approach the university to house it there, or had you thought about housing it in a different entity altogether?
I thought of if I wanted to found a nonprofit and do it that way, but the university offered some really critical components, one of which was the Indian Law Clinic. So there are a few Indian law clinics across the country. One of, a top one is at the University of Montana. And so I had access to that. So when I was there as faculty, I could see different researchers in different fields doing various, research that was relevant to American Indians, reservation economies, public health issues, just a really broad array of topics. So I also saw that the university and for that matter, the Montana university system as a whole had professional level researchers who were doing relevant research to American Indians and in our communities. And so I thought, with the Indian Law Clinic and that, breadth of research going on, those expert researchers and then students, really that was, all, the right mix of ingredients. So I was, really wanted to found the Policy Institute at the university for those reasons.
And so the announcement was made earlier this year. At what stage are you at right now with this think tank? Are you actually starting to look at topics that you want to research? What stage are you at now?
Yeah, so currently we're we have undertaken a needs assessment. So right now I'm just starting to work with tribal governments, various department heads, council members to assess the policy development needs in their communities. So what they perceive as the most pressing issues, some long range goals, things like that. And so once we have that done, it should be done by next fall, then we will have a research agenda. And after that, we'll be able to start putting out those policy statements, reports, just get really diving into the work of the think tank.
All right. And Chairman Gray, as a former teacher, how do you think this think tank can help improve the education there in Montana for Native students?
Well, I think, everything these days is data driven. And I think with this institute, the tribes because we're pulled in a lot of different directions, the tribal councils, that we can then rely on Heather and this institute to provide that data that's going to help, if we're applying for grants or such things as that throughout Indian country as a whole.
And so when you're looking at education, I know Montana has had on the books for a long time a mandate to teach Native American education. But do you see an area where this think tank could help even improve that?
Oh, definitely. Under Montana's law, the Indian Education for All, I think with this think tank, it's going to help, be a driving force with Montana tribal colleges and even down to the high school levels on the reservations.
Sure. And Gail, you already work with the tribe. What topics do you want to see addressed first?
I think, it's important that we seize the moment. COVID, the pandemic has really changed the landscape across Indian country. So now we're looking at what policies are necessary for us to develop our economy and bring new stakeholders to the table. Oftentimes you find the stakeholders like banks, for example, they're very reluctant to lend on reservations. We have very few banks across Indian country. So the policies they want to see are like a uniform commercial code, which tribal governments have the sovereignty to enact. And in that process, we were able to get a bank on Northern Cheyenne, our first bank, for example. Similarly, during COVID, we're really struggling with food sovereignty. So I see a real need to look at the policies of all the federal public lands around our reservations and trying to access them. These were our ancestral lands, like the Custer Forest next to Northern Cheyenne. This was where we still have our people buried. We would like to gain access into the Custer Forest to begin hunting again, the elk and the deer in that area, to address food sovereignty. We're in a real tough time with COVID, a lot of issues that are coming to the forefront. And with the shutdown of the Coal Strip coal mine, this is like 10 miles from Northern Cheyenne. It's the largest coal strip mine in the United States. Very similar to what's happening on Navajo and Hopi with Black Mesa shutting down. What's going to happen to those 200 Cheyennes that are employed there? So these are the real critical policy issues that are out there that we need a strategic plan, almost like a Marshall Plan. My friend Wilma Mankiller used to say, Indian country needs a Marshall Plan. We've never had one.
Wow, yeah, absolutely. Wilma was a forward thinker and really understood how tribes could help out, but it's cutting through this red tape, but it's also researching and finding out ways that tribes can engage in these kinds of economic development and also changing laws. And you point out the pandemic and how that's shown the disparities, when it comes to Indian country, and the whole issue of food sovereignty. We've been reporting on that. We've been hearing about tribes who've asked for emergency hunts. So, they live in remote areas, fresh food is hard to come by. And so the best thing is to go out and the land, just as the land provided for them in the past, it can provide for them, right now. So creating this think tank in the middle of a pandemic, what were some of the issues that perhaps you had to address when you started this, Heather?
Well, so immediately any travel plan, so outreach was curtailed, of course. And as you know, like relationship building is so critical to creating a atmosphere of trust where we can work with tribes, tribal governments, tribal community members on gathering data, on our research. And so I would say that was, that was unexpected. That has stalled things just a bit, but fortunately, all of the tribal councils are continuing to meet via Zoom. So I'm still able to contact and engage, but not to the degree that I would have been, or that I would prefer to be doing at this time due to the pandemic.
Yeah, and again, we can't say enough about the pandemic. I mean, who would have thought we'd be living through a pandemic? And how are we as Indian nations addressing the pandemic? And so, Chairman Gray, I'm going to turn to you and ask you that question because, again, we're looking at a very different time. And when you're looking at also research that think tanks do and data that think tanks collect, there is, I think, a hesitancy among a lot of tribal nations about who owns that data and who owns that research. Can you talk a little bit about the concerns when it comes to that and how you guys are going to alleviate that with this think tank?
Yeah, I think that is a big concern in Indian country, because we've had in the past a lot of what we research non-Indian people and universities come to our communities and want to do research, and then take that data and who knows what they do with it. So now as we start to develop this think tank with Heather, I think the important part is knowing that it's driven by Indians for Indians is a big thing. And then we, keep that data in-house, so to speak, where it's released as Heather would determine who gets to see it, when and where, which is a good thing for Indian country because it's very important. We just can't, be releasing that stuff to anybody anymore as it has been done in the past.
So Heather, when it comes to addressing that issue and working with the tribes, what kind of protocols have you set up, and have you set that up with the tribal input?
So at this point, I've been working with the director of the Indian Law Clinic at the University of Montana to craft sort of a template agreement, because data sovereignty is really important for tribes. Like Chairman Gray noted, researchers come into Indian country, they have outside funding, they're doing their own research agenda. They're there and then they're gone. And sometimes tribes have no idea, whatever happens with that information. So very much the American Indian Governance and Policy Institute intends to work with tribes in the collection of that data, all of that information, and that is collected on behalf of that tribal government's request to have research around a particular topic. So the agreement that we're in the process of crafting right now is just a template agreement that can be reviewed by tribal attorneys. It can be modified, but basically it would say that we have permission to be in that community, to do that research for the tribe, and what we're going to do with that research, basically to give it back to the tribe in the form of policy research, reports, policy statements, template tribal codes and ordinances. That type of policy work will be returned to the tribe in the form of that. But also we have a database that we're building as part of the American Indian Governance and Policy website, because we want to house this research, make it available to anybody, anywhere who wants to see what's going on, what have tribes done, these innovative things that they're doing, innovative, indigenous infused and informed policies, so they can get ideas, see, what's been done elsewhere, would that work in their community, have that research, have those ideas, have those template ordinances, have access to all of that. So that's what we plan to do at this point.
Well, it sounds exciting, and there's so much to think about and to consider, and certainly you're focused on the tribes there in Montana, and then who knows where this can go from there. Gail, talk a little bit about, again, just that idea of what tribes may need and what this think tank can help provide in terms of data.
I think it's good to go to big picture. And right now, in particular, you look at the Biden, Harris transition team that's moving in. I think it's really important to look at the positioning of Indian tribes and our knowledge. Where are we? Why are we the only human beings in the Department of the Interior, right? Along with fish, wildlife, national parks, and federal public lands. That's where we are as human beings. So why are Indian tribes positioned there? And then bringing that down to home, why is it that our voice is erased or invisible? There's a whole movement across Indian country, right? This invisible movement. So it's also like a big push. Why is it that we're the only human beings in the Department of the Interior, and yet there's never been an Indian person who's the Secretary of the Interior? So just being able to pull that kind of knowledge and position So people, it's like an eye opener, right? It says a lot. If you can get that kind of data, that kind of facts, like across Montana, how much do Indian tribes and Indian people contribute to the economy? Why are we still struggling to get a single Indian judge in Montana? Why are there no Indian commissioners in Billings? You know, so you start thinking about data can drive action. Data can drive policy, but it's meaningful. You know, we don't want to be spinning our wheels like, you know, I've been a professor too of Indian law. I always find the distinction between Indians and non-Indian students so striking. Indian students do meaningful research. They select topics that are going to have actual impact on their lives and their communities' lives. They're not theoretical. So our research is not something you're going to throw on the bookshelf that I do a lot of, because it's not relevant. That's the kind of focus that we would like to have.
Well, you're reminding me that at one point, the Department of Interior had on its website that it was the caretaker and overseer of our nation's treasures, you know, meaning the land and such. But I took that as the nation's treasures as Native people, right? So you just have to think, right? Yeah. So where is the treatment part of that in that case? And also, it's interesting because, you know, Native Americans are the only race of people mentioned in the U.S. Constitution. So again, it goes back to that treatment. And so if we're the only race mentioned in the U.S. Constitution, there's a reason for that, right?
Well, it goes back to the founding of this country. You know, that's the big movement now across, you know, really the world is healing, right? Telling the truth as to how these countries were founded, you know, how the whole continents were divvied up, and telling the truth. And that's going to bring about I think really a transformation, a paradigm shift of thinking. And I think it's going to come from the young people. I really do. I think that, you know, the backlash we're seeing from that older generation trying to hold on to some type of privilege, you know, is fading out. And that's what we're living through right now.
Do you see that as well, Chairman Gray?
Oh yeah, definitely. I think there is a big shift within Indian country and the United States in terms of you know, Indian country is becoming this, you know, we're not just this afterthought anymore. We're becoming the forefront of a lot of different things that stakeholders across the country are now seeing that, hey, wait a minute, we have a bigger voice here. And this goes across everything in terms of economics, housing, education through Indian country. Yeah, for sure. It's a big movement, I think.
You know, that power of the native vote and how it swayed so many elections and turned some states, you know, blue. So that, you know, again, these kinds of examples, the data that you're going to be collecting can back up these kinds of examples.
Definitely. And there was actually a really instrumental report that sort of triggered that paradigm shift for a lot of people in Montana, how Gail mentioned just a few minutes ago. And it was compiled by Eleanor Yellowrobe, and it just explored the economic contributions of the tribes in Montana. And it, you know, looked at a period of 2003 through 2009. And it found that over the course of those years, tribal governments, just by virtue of their existence and their, you know, employing people, et cetera, brought in $1 billion a year, over $1 billion a year collectively to the state's economy, so that we are participating in crafting, you know, a statewide economy and what that looks like. You know, I think that's probably one of the most poignant examples of how collecting data, you know, it can influence people's mindsets.
And even though we're in this pandemic, you know, some think tanks hold some kind of seminars, they have conferences and things like that. Do you plan to hold these kinds of meetings virtually?
Yeah, definitely. I'm doing virtual meetings with tribal governments at this point. And, you know, hopefully, you know, by next fall, maybe can travel to the reservations. But at this point, yeah, just we're doing everything virtually.
And then, but in terms of having like a public event that could be, held on Zoom or held on some kind of virtual platform, is that one of the benchmarks that you've set for this first year?
For the first year, I'm still ironing out some of the final details of the structure and the functioning, also finding funding, in conducting the needs assessment. So right now, that's all that I have on my for the coming year on my agenda, but definitely hope to have public events in the future.
All right, and some of the more well-known think tanks in the country, include things like the Brookings Institute, Cato Institute, the Human Rights Watch Institute, and Aspen Institute as well. When you're looking across the board at these other think tanks, where do you see? I mean, because that doesn't necessarily have to be the goal for this institute, Heather. But what would be the goal for your think tank?
I think that based on, the structure of settler colonialism and international law, that a lot of issues that are relevant and exist on Indian reservations exist elsewhere in the world, just as a result of that history. And so I think that some of the items that we put out are going to be relevant, not just nationally, but also internationally. And I'm really excited about that.
And what kind of reaction have you received so far from not just Indian country, but across the board now that you've announced this think tank, Heather?
So far, the feedback has been really positive, and I'm really excited to have that positivity surrounding this.
All right. And Chairman Gray, what do you want people to really know about this think tank and the work that it will be doing in the coming years?
Yeah, I think what I'd like them to know is that it's going to help support tribal governments that we don't have access to this kind of research and data, that it's going to be there at our fingertips, that it's going to help drive a lot of policies throughout Indian country.
Anything in specific?
I think the biggest thing right now for us is, a lot of economic development. I think on reservations, that's a key to success for us tribes and our people.
All right. And Gail, what about you? What do you want people to really know about this think tank?
I think that there's innovative thinking up here in Montana. We've got many Indian tribes, vast territories. Some of our reservations are as big as states. We're these large land-based tribes up here, and there's still a lot of culture and language. What we have maintained here is very rich culturally. And I'd like people to see us as like not standalone, but we want to work with you, right? We can share and partner our knowledge base. Like I was on the think tank really that created the NCAI think tank. We met for about a year in creating that think tank, and I think there's other opportunities besides the structure of how existing think tanks are set up. I'd like us to really look at traditional knowledge. Climate change is a big issue we're dealing with right now, with Biden appointing, Kerry as the czar, the climate czar. So we can fit right into that, particularly with our knowledge of having lived in this land for generations upon generations. That knowledge is nowhere in Western science. It's discounted. This institute, we're hoping, will lift that knowledge up on a par with Western science.
And you probably saw that a lot this past fire season, because so many lands that are not that are not held by tribes were just ravaged by wildfires, and yet tribal people have managed for time immemorial. So that knowledge that you talk about, that traditional knowledge of the land and also the climate, certainly has a place in climate change talks that we'll be entering in. And especially as the U.S. ends up going back into the Paris Agreement. Thank you so much for that, Gail. Heather, what do you really want people to know about this think tank?
I'm just really excited about it, and want people to know that, part of the website has a tab called Innovative Ideas. So like Gail noted, Chairman Gray noted, Indians are facing a lot of interesting circumstances, but there's massive amounts of innovation. There's also, we can fall back on traditional knowledge. We can craft policies that reflect Indigenous values, Indigenous economies, food sovereignty, all of that. And if you go to the website, you'll see that I've compiled probably about 100 stories in the news in the last 3 or 4 years that feature all of that.
So I just want to say thank you so much, Gail Small, for joining us. Thank you.
You're welcome. It's been a pleasure.
And Heather Cahoon, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
And Chairman Gerald Gray, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate it.
And thank you for watching. Take care of yourselves. Your life is precious. I'm Patty Thawahungva. Join us again tomorrow.
You got to take a stand just because you know you can. Oh, you got to run, you got to run.
Indian Country Today is recorded at the Phoenix Indian School Visitor Center in Phoenix, Arizona.
This is Indian Country Today.